We've got a doozy of a remake here, as we're updating our early video on Rhydon and Rhyperior. We'll keep this intro brief, because we've got a lot to get into, so here we go. Rhydon was arguably the first Pokemon ever created, both according to Ken Sugimori and with its 001 index number in Generation 1. It is also famously the subject of the aim for the horn meme by virtue of Ash's Pikachu in a stunning display of anime logic, bypassing Rhydon's supposed electric immunity by simply attacking its horn. So much for that ground typing, especially mocked thanks to Rhydon gaining the electric immunity ability Lightning Rod in Gen 3 because of its horn. Anyway, in Gen 4, when traded while holding the Protector item, it evolved into Rhydon 2.0, aka Rhyperior, bringing you bigger and better Rhydon for our crazy power-crept modern age. At the time, anyway. So let's dive into how this duo performed in the competitive scene. And so, we ask, how great were Rhydon and Rhyperior actually? But before we start, this video is sponsored by Maraibo Go. Have you ever wanted to play another certain creature collector game, but you didn't want to pay for it and also you want to play it on your phone? Well, luckily for you, Maraibo Go is here. Maraibo Go is a creature collector that combines open world exploration and other combat elements for endless fun and possibilities. There's over 100 plus pals to collect, and you can use them to battle other pals, bosses, and of course, construct your base. You can invite your friends to build a base and survive together in the world as you keep collecting more pals. Or if you're more competitive, you can invite your friends to play against you to see who is the better tamer. Maraibo Go also has cross-platform compatibility, so you can enjoy the convenience of mobile gaming while also seamlessly playing on PC. Yup, it runs that well. Again, this is a free game, so if you're interested, click the link in the description below to play Maraibo Go for free. And thank you so much to Maraibo Go for sponsoring this video. And in this video, we'll be going over these competitive formats. Gen 1 Rhydon is the quintessential physical attacker in many ways. Its huge attack, tied for the highest in Gen 1, is complemented by great physical bulk with both excellent defense and massive HP. On the other hand, its special bulk is awful despite that HP stat on account of not just poor special defense, but famously flawed typing riddling it with devastating weaknesses to common special attacking types, and its miserable speed meant it is easily outpaced by pretty much everything, very much including the many Pokemon brandishing such attacks. These issues that would plague Rhydon and other physical attackers like it began here. Additionally, despite its great physical bulk, its rock ground typing was also flawed in giving it a weakness to none other than Earthquake. However, that typing also has many strengths offensively and defensively, and is a major contributor to Rhydon's role as one of RBY's most elite Pokemon. Most notably, it was the only true counter in the game to the monstrously threatening Zapdos, whose vicious stab combination otherwise sliced the entire tier apart, but was completely blanked by Rhydon. Indeed, Rhydon's presence was just about single-handedly the one thing deterring much higher Zapdos usage. In a game without Rhydon, Zapdos was genuinely Tauros-level threatening. Rhydon's rock typing and great physical bulk also made it a prime candidate for catching and punishing predicted Hyper Beams from Tauros. Now, for a long time, Rhydon locked in a battle for rock ground supremacy with Golem, but over time, the player base realized Rhydon was wholly superior. Yes, Golem had Explosion, but its issue was that it was much weaker than Rhydon, meaning it wasn't nearly as threatening without blowing up, and you didn't want to rely purely on Explosion to get something done, especially on the Pokemon needed to counter Zapdos. Rhydon, on the other hand, smashed pretty much the entire tier with its stab off that massive attack. Earthquake alone blasted apart pretty much everything besides Exeggutor. Well, technically it did nothing to Zapdos as well as Moltres and Articuno, but none of those Pokemon wanted to switch into Rhydon, and the latter two were on the rarer side. Now, Eggy did take those EQs quite well, but it didn't appreciate Rhydon's rock slides much at all, especially given Rhydon's repeated opportunities to fire them off, given how badly it abused not just Zapdos, but paralyzed Special Walls Chansey and Alakazam. Body Slam's paralysis was quite ruinous too, and was quite helpful for deterring Starmie switch-ins as well. And even if Rhydon wasn't spreading the para itself, it was a superb paralysis abuser with Substitute, especially since its huge HP stat gave it subs unbroken by a single Chansey Seismic Toss. Reflect Chansey and Snorlax couldn't slow it down either, since Rhydon could drop Body Slam for the Reflect-breaking Leer. Over time, Exeggutor usage began to drop, and thus Rhydon had clear shots with just Earthquake, rampaging through entire teams, brandishing its immense power that 2-hit KO Chansey, and cut through even Slowbro, being used to act as a check to the latter while resting. Between completely shutting down Zapdos and being one of the scariest physical threats in its own right, Rhydon was an absolutely incredible Pokemon in Gen 1 OU, and for the same exact reasons, had a place in Ubers as well, with its Earthquakes were strong enough to 3-hit KO Mewtwo, making it similarly fairly dangerous with paralysis support. So overall, Rhydon had a massively successful first generation. With its normal resist and huge physical bulk, Rhydon took on that all-important role of Snorlax check in Gen 2 OU, while also doubling as help against the legendary Electrics, Zapdos, and Raikou. Its main flaw was that, unlike Steelix, it was weak to the standard electric choice of Hidden Power Ice, so it had to be more careful when pivoting into Thunder. It also competed with another similar Pokemon whose typing was better overall, Tyranitar, who packed an excellent Psychic immunity, and Rhydon's threat level, while certainly notable, was less generally splashable than Steelix's access to Explosion or Tyranitar's wide array of coverage and much better speed. However, Rhydon's substantial strength ensured it was always a notable part of the tier. Its ferocious dual stabs were as scary as ever, if not scarier now that they could be bolstered by Curse, which alongside Roar, let it win Curse Wars against Snorlax and prevented it from getting walled by non-toxic Skarmory. Being able to pivot into Thunder and directly threaten Zapdos in return was a major benefit as well. As such, Rhydon found its place on many stall teams, as well as certain paralysis abusing offenses. Some teams even used the gimmicky but potentially devastating Zap Cannon Rhydon, which was risky, but if it connected, it was ruinous for Cloyster and Skarmory and made it excellent support for Belly Drum Snorlax. Sadly, in more recent years, Rhydon gained another major competitor. In an inversion of their Gen 1 dynamic, Golem burst onto the scene and became one of the most important Pokemon in the tier thanks to the incredible utility of its Rapid Spin. Support in conjunction with the ability to detonate a boom at any time made it much more flexible to slot on a team and be used in battle. Plus, the massive explosion and Golem usage increased Hidden Power water usage on not just Zapdos and Raikou, but even Gengar. Even Snorlax started using Surf sometimes. Rhydon's opportunities became severely limited. At least Golem could still pull off a spin or explosion when barely surviving such hits, whereas Rhydon was much less immediately impactful. Rhydon still retained a place in the tier. In addition to being the scariest of its rivals as a paralysis abuser, it began experimenting with Counter to destroy both Earthquake Snorlax and Zapdos Hidden Power Ice, since Counter bounced back all hidden powers in Gens 2 and 3. Rhydon even lowered its special defense EVs to ensure the Counter would one-hit KO Zapdos, completely turning the tables in a matchup it'd otherwise lose thanks to Zapdos' infuriating ability to tank a Rock Slide, and Rhydon needing to be in pristine condition to avoid a 2-hit KO. Overall, Rhydon had a decent enough Generation 2, though it was a step down from the first, and it was a similar story in Ubers, between Tyranitar's anti-Mewtwo talents and Golem's Rapid Spin, making them generally preferred as rocks, while Steelix was even better than in OU. Gen 3 OU had plenty of rock action going on, between Tyranitar defining the tier and Aerodactyl's dominance of the late game. It didn't leave much room for Rhydon's incredibly low speed and equally exploitable weaknesses. Sure, Rhydon has some nice traits, like Stab Earthquake that slammed bulky waters hard and ensured Metagross didn't want to come anywhere near it. Its physical bulk was also much better than Tyranitar's, letting it eat up Earthquakes from the tier's many physical attackers, including Tyranitar and Aerodactyl, and being much more difficult to revenge kill with Dugtrio. Additionally, Rhydon's Mega Horn was much stronger than Hidden Power Bug, ensuring Clado wouldn't be able to stop it at all. And Rhydon also gained access to Swords Dance, which would let it cut through Skarmory much more easily. As such, there were several attempts to make Rhydon work alongside paralysis support, but apart from the occasional game, such attempts floundered. Rhydon had to be a sparing specific surprise, given how easy it was to render useless with multitudes of weaknesses, including a quadruple weak to the Hidden Power grasses flying everywhere. It was far too strong for UU though, so Gen 3 mostly passed Rhydon by. Rhydon's evolution into Rhyperior was among the most hyped of the new additions in Gen 4. A stratospheric attack stat, hulking defense, and even buff special defense, the latter two also going beautifully with Rhyperior's HP, a substantial upgrade where, like attack and defense, Rhydon had already been excellent. The real kicker though was Rhyperior's new ability, Solid Rock, which slashed the damage of super effective moves to 75% of their usual effectiveness. Oh, and this is in a generation where rock types received a special defense boost in Sand. Everyone freaked out at first. How are you going to take things down? And moreover, how are you going to prevent it from rampaging through your team? After all, it wasn't just stronger through attack, but it also had received an upgrade to Rock Stab with the addition of Stone Edge. It could boost its attacks without locking into one of them with Life Orb, and it had received Rock Polish, finally allowing it to circumvent that awful speed. You could easily just attack with that amazing stab combination, so you could throw Swords Dance in the last slot and really crush everything in sight. Oh, and on top of it all, it could now provide the best support move in the game with Stealth Rock. Rhyperior seemed primed to absolutely ruin OU. So did it? Oh sure, people tried it, and it had its good points, but Rhyperior was basically Rhydon 2.0. This is of course a good thing in that it took everything good about Rhydon and cranked it up, and Rhydon already had a lot going for it. The problem? It did nothing to fix Rhydon's major flaws of being very slow and having a lot of very exploitable weaknesses. Okay, Solid Rock did help a little, especially with how high its physical bulk was, and while Sandstorm was bolstering its special defense further. And while these were actually very good against weaknesses Rhyperior had to say close combat or hidden power ice, they weren't nearly enough to compensate for the quadruple weaknesses to the water and grass moves flying around every which way. Oh, and Rock Polish wasn't getting it too far with that utterly pathetic speed stat. Now, don't get us wrong, Rhyperior certainly maintained a niche in OU. It was just a highly specific choice, meaning its usage resulted in its fall to UU. As unthinkable as that was in those halcyon days of early Diamond and Pearl, where the standard player base feared for their safety. Before we tell you about UU Rhyperior though, we'll tell you about the ways in which Rhyperior could wind up being among the scariest surprises one might see in an OU battle. Sandstorm was a necessity of course, but that wasn't much of a restriction. Not only did it form a particularly terrifying dual rock type attack with Tyranitar, with some players opting for Choice Band Tyranitar to throw as many brutal stone edges at the opponent as possible, but one could also opt out of the overlapping weaknesses of dual rocks and use the ever sturdy support staple Hippowdon as the sand setter. Either way though, Rhyperior needed some more help to succeed. Some special defense investment of course, which turned it into actually quite the excellent Heatran counter. Fire Blast bounced off, and even Earth Powers weren't too scary. So long as there wasn't an HP Grass to fear, Rhyperior turned Heatran into a setup opportunity, as it did other OU staples like Zapdos. What did Rhyperior do once it was in? It set up a sub on the Force Switch and removed the needed for predicting what was coming in, allowing it to bludgeon whatever the response was with its hardest hitting attack, which tended to leave quite a mark, while also guarding itself against annoyances like Rotom A's Will-O-Wisp. Rhyperior's 101 HP subs also guarded it against Blissey's Seismitoss, making it another key piece of setup fodder, especially as the fact that Blissey that ran Ice Beam still wouldn't even break Rhyperior's sub in the sand. In the last slot, Rhyperior often opted for Swords Dance to crush Skarmory and opposing Hippowdon, though it could also run Ice Punch to ruin irritating Breloom, Gliscor, and Flygon. But wait, what of Rhyperior's low speed? That's where its other teammates came in. It quickly became apparent that Rhyperior was to be supported with copious Thunder Waves from teammates like Starmie, Celebi, Zapdos, Jirachi, and Blissey. As such, OU Rhyperior popped up on rare occasion, but when it did, it was used by great players who knew how to maximize its extraordinary bludgeoning talents. So how did the Pokemon that was feared to throttle OU wind up faring in UU? Quite well, of course, nowhere near broken, but it was excellent and a staple of the tier in many roles. It switched in on plenty with its huge bulk and solid typing, which led to its primary role as one of the tier's best stealth rockers, and once the rocks were popped up, it proceeded to threaten just about everything in sight with its powerful hits. The lower power level in UU was wonderful, as Rhyperior was able to shrug off all manner of hits far more easily than in OU. With Solid Rock, it could eat something as strong as Kabutops' Waterfall, so most every other physical attack was bouncing off, even something like Absol's Superpower. Even many special attacks like Mismagius' Shadow Ball weren't particularly frightening if Rhyperior gave itself a bit of special defense investment, and Raikou, when it was in the tier, wouldn't be much of a threat with Hidden Power Ice either. There are also many Pokemon Rhyperior blanked completely, like Arcanine, Scyther, and Swellow. If you wanted to focus entirely on Rhyperior's offensive output, you could definitely do that. The classic sub from OU wreaked havoc on UU as well, preying on common walls like Registeel and Clefable, though here Rhyperior's fourth move slot was most commonly Mega Horn for the tier's many key grasses and psychics like Torterra, Leafeon, Uxie, and Mesprit. It was massively difficult for Stall to handle with how it abused Pokemon like Chansey and Spiritomb, and only had to break through Weezing, which for all its bulk, still didn't like taking Stone Edges. Additionally, the aforementioned lower power level also meant lower speed, and thus meant Rhyperior had a much easier time pulling off Rock Polish sets, which were among the most feared late game cleaners around. UU players loved sliding Rhyperior onto their teams. Whichever form it took, it would put in work on a game-to-game basis. Plus, there was nothing more satisfying than using a tank Rhyperior and facing a substitute Moltres thinking it would easily pressure stall Stone Edges, only to get absolutely obliterated by Rock Blast. And as strange as it was for the BL Rhydon to have its evolution going to UU the following generation, stranger still was Rhydon itself going to NU, where it fit in perfectly. It established itself as a solid stealth rocker, taking on the likes of Tauros, while, unlike the tier's go-to stealth rocking rock type Regirock, hitting hitting pretty much everything in the tier incredibly hard with its stab combination. The combination was so good, it could run Swords Dance in its last slot to really put the pressure on. Very few Pokemon had the dexterity to pull off both Rocks and SD on the same set, but Rhydon's need for Mega Horn was much lower, so it could afford it, even if the situations where it got to pull it off were quite rare. It needed paralysis support if it wanted to go on an SD fueled rampage because of how slow it was in regards to the walls it wanted to break through. But should the opponent be sufficiently slowed down, watch out, because Enyu was really not ready for Rhydon's level of power should outrunning it not be an option. Rhydon's main issue was that as a stealth rocker, Regirock was far more consistent, lacking its quadruple weaknesses and packing much greater special bulk that actually allowed it to take on the tier's primary threat, Charizard, while being more difficult to take down in general. As such, Rhydon was relegated to a more specific use. This didn't mean it was bad by any means, it just had to be used on teams that appreciated its stronger offensive leanings. For this reason, rather than feign attempts towards longevity with leftovers, it preferred the opportunities created through various berries. Custap Berry was a favorite for letting it turn the tables with a big smash against a would-be revenge killer from low health, turning the hits Rhydon was tasked with taking into an offensive tool later on. The fact that it couldn't stay in safely against Charizard mattered less this way. Pivot into a Fire Blast, switch from the HP Grass, take advantage of the fact that Fire Blast had just knocked you closer to Custap. Alternatively, Rhydon went the resistance route. Chople Berry let it slug it out with Hitmonchan, Shuka Berry protected it from all manner of earthquakes, and Rindle Berry let it just barely hang on against a Charizard HP Grass. All in all, Rhydon was a strong NU Pokemon, capping off a superb generation for both itself and Rhyperior. You wouldn't think Rhyperior was much of a VGC presence, what with the slowness and the weaknesses to all the surfs and blizzards and earthquakes flying around. And indeed, while it was far from a defining meta staple, it still had a very strong Rock Slide, one of the best moves in VGC, as well as usage on some Trick Room teams due to its slowness. Its best appearance was in 2009, where Japan's Tasuku Mono rocked it to a second place finish at Worlds. He used it on a Sand team alongside Hippowdon, and the pair was further supported by Moltres, Zapdos, Yanmega, and Shedinja, a seriously unorthodox team. But even with just Shedinja protecting against water, Tasuku proved his skill with his success. In fact, the two teams he finished ahead of in third and fourth both had a minimum of 3 water types, with the fourth place team being straight up mono water. Rhyperior's mortal fear of all things water was particularly glaring in Gen 5's rain-heavy landscape, to say nothing of the grass-happy Sun teams, and its brutally low speed was worse than ever in a game that just got faster, so it could forget of reprising any OU niches. But as far as the tier below was concerned, it remained an excellent Pokemon. It was quite fond of the fact that Gen 5 UU in many ways resembled Gen 4 OU, and thus it was able to find opportunity against many familiar faces, as well as the newcomers it similarly thwarted with its bulk that allowed it to pop rocks, then pop opponents with Rock Stab. It was an amazing blanket answer to several of the very scariest Pokemon in the tier: Snorlax, Togekiss, the fire duo of Victini and Darmanitan, and the electric duo of Zapdos and Raikou. Its stealth rocky support was now bolstered by the fact that it could phase the opponent and still attack nicely with Dragon Tail. Its damage was a move much easier to slot in than Roar, and ensured Snorlax couldn't attempt to muscle its way through a one-on-one with Curse Boost, while also flinging Flygon from the field and generally forcing foes to flee. A strategy that especially shone in tandem with the spikes Rhyperior was often used alongside, given its excellent synergy with Roserade. Rhyperior only really needed this set though. Rock Polish variants weren't getting very far with how easily they were outsped by pretty much anything holding a Choice Scarf, and Rhyperior's defensive reach was too useful to not make use of its stealth rocking talents, so ideas of Substitute, Swords Dance, or Choice Band didn't amount to anything, especially since Rhyperior's team really needed it to take the hits that would impede its offensive threat that wouldn't get too far given it was left in the dust by just about everything in the tier besides Cofagrigus, and UU wasn't exactly known for its paralysis spam. Still, Rhyperior was utterly superb as an offensive support Pokemon. Check the biggest threats, pop up the rocks, then slam just about everything in sight. Even if there's a Gligar to wall you, it's fine. Dragon Tail it out with Rock Sub and you're wreaking some havoc. Rhydon received an immense buff in the form of Generation 5's edition of Eviolite, which cranked its physical bulk to Rhyperior levels. For super effective hits, it effectively functioned as a built-in solid rock, while making Rhydon better at tanking neutral hits. In a nutshell, of course, since this came at the significant cost of leftovers, but Rhydon wasn't trying to be a permanent wall, and nor was Rhyperior really. So Eviolite's increase in hit-taking capability, which of course also boosted its paltry special defense past Rhyperior, was an all-around enhancement to Rhydon's tank hits and dish 'em out back playstyle. This new and improved Rhydon fit into the new sub-UU tier, RU, where it quickly demonstrated itself as a superb Pokemon, capable of taking on major threats like Druddigon and the move Volt Switch, reliably popping up Stealth Rock and providing a significant source of offensive pressure in its own right. Rhydon was used as a much more aggressive version of Steelix on hard-hitting offense teams that wanted even their stealth rocker to bring the pain. Its most obvious advantage was its greater damage output, yes, but similarly helpful was its fire resistance, majorly useful in pivoting around both of Moltres' stabs as well as Scarf and Boar's massive flare blitz, a significant threat to the offensive team's Rhydon was used on. Rhydon was generally less splashable than Steelix thanks to the universal superiority of Steel as a defensive typing, specifically as it related to taking on Durant and Steelix's ability to hold leftovers, letting it function more efficiently on bulkier teams. However, Rhydon was still excellent, holding teams together and crushing pretty much everything not named the Alomomola with its stabs and Mega Horn. The latter was especially useful to ensure Tangrowth, which was generally going to be a team's best physical hit taker, couldn't take it on safely. All in all, Rhydon was excellent in RU, concluding another terrific generation for itself and its evolution. Despite Rhyperior's struggles against common attacking types magnified by the doubles format, its talents were also utilized by a select few enterprising trainers. First, Huey used Lightning Rod Rhyperior as support for, and this is true, the surprisingly effective Choice Specs Gyarados. He itself stated he didn't intend to actually bring Rhyperior to battles much, but its very presence in deterring Electrics from being chosen at Team Preview changed how the team functioned greatly. He rocked the team to success at the 2012 Last Chance Qualifier and finished top 10 at Worlds. Additionally, Germany's Benjamin Gadash slotted Rhyperior onto a Sand Trick Room team with Tyranitar and Cresselia, weaponizing Rhyperior's low speed and finished 4th at the UK Nationals that year. In 2013, Rhyperior notched some more appearances, used by Inosh Shakar on an Abomasnow team to reach 2nd at the US Nationals. It also had several starring appearances in the senior division, as Ben Hickey reached 2nd with it at Worlds. And not only that, Devon I also reached 2nd with it at the US Nationals, while Masin B used it to reach top 8 at the Italian Nationals and to win German Nationals, and Trainer Harry reached 5th with it at the Australian Nationals. But it wasn't just Rhyperior anymore though. Eviolite Rhydon joined the fray, its superior hit-taking abilities on full display as its Lightning Rod supported its team. Most notably, Benjamin Gold rocked it to a 4th place finish at Worlds, using it on a Hail Trick Room team. In addition to its team support, Benjamin used Substitute Rhydon to function as a genuine threat under Trick Room, beautifully abusing the protects and switches utilized to try and stall Trick Room out. So all in all, a highly successful VGC generation for the Ride duo. Rhyperior actually saw the briefest usage in OU in early XY, mostly because players were utterly terrified of Mega Charizard X, and Rhyperior was a perfect counter to it, as well as completely stifling Talonflame. However, players also quickly realized that Hippowdon was generally going to do this job just as well, if not better thanks to Slackoff, as well as the massive team support it brought with Sandstream, and of course the superior defensive typing that was Pure Ground. As such, Rhyperior fell to UU, but it didn't really make much of an impact there either. It didn't match up well with many of the top tier threats. It couldn't even take on the defining physical attacker Mega Aerodactyl since it got decked by Aquatail, so Rhyperior fell to a new home, RU, and there it was utterly superb. Its usual game, the hard-hitting stealth-rocking tank, was right at home in this low-power environment. It took on several old faces like Dredagon and Moltres, as well as new ones like Delphox and Jolteon. And in addition to this defensive use, it was a nightmare to switch into. It was a physical attacker that, thanks to Mega Horn, Cresselia didn't want any part of, with Mega Horn also assisting greatly against the eternal pain that was Reuniclus. With its impressive stats, Rhyperior towered over RU en route to becoming one of the best, most defining Pokemon of the tier's XY era. Auras came and Rhyperior continued its excellence. Sure, it wasn't quite as defining in the Venusaur-dominated balance-heavy metagame, but it was still a superb Pokemon, a remarkably sturdy stealth rocker. It had to be careful of the massively common knockoff, removing its leftovers, but it still switched in plenty, terrorizing staples like Registeel, and besides, it already loved the reinforcement of its health through Alomomola's huge wishes, replenishing even Rhyperior's huge HP. It could play the long game well itself, distributing toxics to its checks easily, as no toxic immune Pokemon comfortably switch into its massive stabs. Auras RU was also unique in that Rhyperior wasn't just rehashing its usual niche, it could also dish out some serious carnage with a choice band set. Nothing in the tier could switch in safely. You'd think, oh, at least Bronzong can, then Rhyperior throttles it with a fire punch that also punishes Virizion, looking to switch into its stabs. Not that Virizion didn't already take hefty damage despite the resist. Bronzong and Virizion, for that matter, didn't much enjoy banded Mega Horns either. But forget the coverage, the real strength, and joy for that matter, in banded Rhyperior was how it utterly shattered the balance teams that defined RU. Alomomola, of all things, was 2-hit KO'd by its stabs. Blastoise was in for a similarly nasty surprise if one could provide Rhyperior repeated turns, as was done through switch moves or just plain old double switching, to exploit the common target that was Registeel or even opposing tank Rhyperior. It would shatter shatter just about everything. But wait, there's more. Eventually, Rhyperior found a niche in Oras Yuyu. As the tier became more and more dominated by flying-type defoggers like Mandibuzz and Crobat, Rhyperior stood out as a stealth rocker which these flyers wanted no part of, and was thus key in breaking balance efforts through the maintenance of rocks, as well as of course its own onslaught. It was much more offensively capable ground type than fellow rocker Seismitoad, and it packed a nasty Mega Horn to ensure Celebi would think more than once about trying to take advantage of it. Despite not truly gaining the rank of Yuyu, it certainly had the viability in the tier once again, as demonstrated by its repeated tournament success. Meanwhile, Rhydon returned to NU, where though its tank set continued to excel, it became particularly renowned for its offensive capability first and foremost. It was incredibly dangerous with a double dancing rock polish Swords Dance set, using its tier dwarfing Eviolite boosted bulk to find opportunity to set up not once but potentially twice, and with both boosts under its belt, it was nigh unstoppable. Alternatively, it could just use the one boost, almost always rock polish, and use that tanking ability to withstand revenge killing attempts. It already dropped weakened opponents left and right late game, but not being paper frail made Rhydon even more menacing in such a scenario. It didn't need to run Swords Dance either, frightening though that was for bulkier teams. Rhydon in many cases preferred the immediacy of Mega Horn's superb coverage to increase how easily it could slice through offense, not just for its ability to crush Torterra, but for how much harder it was to hit key targets Mesprit, Lilligant, and Ludicolo. Double Dance Rhydon ended many battles in the late game, but it had to hang back because it couldn't take damage early on lest it compromised its ability to sweep. Stealth Rock Rhydon, on the other hand, was effective as ever at getting in the mix, tanking and dishing out its hits as always, and it was especially valuable because its vicious rock stab threatened the daylights out of Magic Bounce Xatu, the eternal irritation for any team attempting to get up hazards. It was still prediction heavy, as Xatu had the annoying habit of pivoting in even when unexpected to bounce those rocks back, worsening by the inclusion of Grass Knot in its moveset. But Rhydon gave its user the tools to get rocks without having to resort to pursuit teammates. Whichever route it took, Rhydon was a force in NU, one of the tier's very best, the way it stood up to the likes of Tauros and blasted damage on pretty much everything. The Rhy duo racked up another excellent generation in the 6th. With Talonflame, Aegislash, Mega Mawile, and Mega Kangaskhan as popular as they were, the Rhy duo returned in 2014 to take them on, while Rhydon provided beautiful Lightning Rod support for Mega Charizard Y or its own Talonflame, ensuring they didn't have to fear the ever-popular Thundurus. Alternatively, with Solid Rock, enabling it to take super effective hits even as strong as Aegislash's Flash Cannon, Rhyperior became an excellent candidate for weakness policy. With Rhydon, Keegan Biljansky reached 9th at the St. Charles, Missouri Regionals, and Bridger Snow reached 16th at Long Beach, California Regionals. Rhyperior's other placements were as follows. Michael Hutchison reached 5th with Rhyperior at Salem, Oregon Regionals. The Asia Cup saw Indonesia's Amabone reach 13th, Japan's Kasutera reached 27th, and Malaysia's Julian Ali reached 32nd. Trainer Keiko reached 4th at the Brisbane Regionals, and finally Trainer Gilbert reached 5th at Worlds in the senior division with it. In 2015, both Rhys continued to succeed. To hear Harrison Saylor and Colin Ayre put it, as they did when describing the team they both used en route to great regional success, Rhyperior was particularly excellent because of how well it matched up into Mega Salamence, as well as dominating Landorus Therian when using Ice Punch, and its usual excellence into Thundurus and Mega Kangaskhan with solid rock and bulk investment, letting it take even super effective hits quite well, in fact turning them into opportunities for greater damage dished out in return thanks to weakness policy. With Rhyperior, Stephen Botha reached 8th at the Gauteng, South Africa Regionals, Harrison Saylor reached 3rd, and Michael Grossens reached 14th at the Washington Regionals. Colin Ayre won the Wisconsin Regionals, where Matthew Swanson also reached 7th and Mario Serrano reached 8th. Joseph Brummett reached 6th at the Georgia Regionals, Nemanja Sandik reached 9th at the German Nationals, Mustafa Olomi reached 12th at the Australian Nationals, and Zach Dalton reached 19th at the US Nationals. Rhydon had some nice placements too. Its Eviolite Feud bulk was used by Zach Tober to reach 9th at the Melbourne Regionals, and Christian Chenubrada to reach 29th at the German Nationals and 16th at the Italian Nationals. So overall, quite a solid rock of a VGC generation for our duo. It's a familiar yarn, but then Rhyperior was surrounded by familiar faces, and indeed its usual game was effective in whichever tier it found itself in. Gen 7 RU saw Rhyperior surrounded by Registeel and Raikou and Mandibuzz and Tyrantrum, and many others it's seen many times before, using its tanking Stealth Rock set to wonderful effect, taking on threats such as the aforementioned, as well as resisting Noivern's Hurricane and Scarf Salazzle stabs, while dishing out significant damage to just about anything that wanted to switch in, save for Bronzong, and generally being difficult to take down. The popularity of Donphan and Ultra Sun and Moon seemed like it would be a pain for Rhyperior, yet toxic ensured teams reliant on Donphan would find it poison while maintaining Rhyperior's ability to irritate other walls that its tank playstyle wouldn't let it break through directly, like Milotic and Cresselia. Same old Rhyperior, superb at pivoting around all manner of hard hits like Ninetales' Sunny Fire Stabs, and no slouch in the offense department. The choice band set returned to make sure that part was felt in the bones of every player rattled by its monstrous hits. Have fun pivoting your Mega Blastoise into that. Rhyperior's main issue was that water and grass's coverage was everywhere, and this wasn't a new problem, but its increased prominence in Gen 7 RU meant it had more difficult time switching in relative to the lower tiers it appeared in previously. Then, where there wasn't water and grass, there was fighting, and to top it all off, one of the most elite Pokemon in the tier was Metagross. Now Rhyperior could stay in and slug it out with Metagross in a one-on-one. After all, that titanic physical bulk and solid rock meant Rhyperior could stay in on just about any physical attacker in a pinch, and its huge attack and great stabs meant it was delivering a serious blow in return, but it still didn't particularly enjoy Metagross's prominence. This is not to downplay how good Rhyperior was. It was the same old reliable it had been for generations. It's just that by its own standards, Rhyperior was a tad low on the totem pole than before, but this was still anything but low. Speaking of familiar refrains, Rhydon returned to NU, where its greatest strength as a stealth rock setter was its Xatu slamming. Additionally, its stab combination was so robust, it could slot in Swords Dance, which allowed it to double as a particularly threatening destroyer of bulkier teams. Yup, again. Not only did it blast through prime physical hit takers Garbodor and Steelix, it didn't take much chip damage for its +2 attacks to seriously threaten other offensive staples like Slowking and Vaporeon. Facing a faster paced team, no problem. Rhydon didn't need any boost for Edgequake to thrash such frail Pokemon. It was a simple, effective deal, and Rhydon didn't really deviate from it. The prominence of Scarf Passimian meant going for Rock Polish to sweeps was less than advised, so good players generally didn't. While Rhydon was such a great stealth rocker, it felt almost like a waste to have it not provide the moves for its team off the switch-ins its great defensive profile allowed it. Rhydon joined Rhyperior in racking up another great generation. The Gen 7 VGC metagame was much more hostile to Rhydon and Rhyperior's low special bulk and many weaknesses. Thus, they were nearly non-existent. Rhydon was only seen in 2018 twice. Diego Ferreira used it alongside Mega Charizard Y to reach 5th at the Chile special event, while Javier Valdez used the same strategy to reach 17th at Worlds of all places. It wasn't a part of the metagame, but Rhydon's innate talents were still useful in certain situations, so it was nice to see it get a little bit of usage, especially at Worlds. In Generation 8's limited Pokedex, Rhyperior started out in UU, doing classic Rhyperior things, now bolstered by the removal of Hidden Power, increasing the number of Pokemon it could check without fearing of getting dropped by a random HP grass. Its great stats gave it plenty of switch-ins where it first used rocks, a bit less powerful now with the inclusion of heavy-duty boots, but still not a problem, because after it got rocks, it started dishing out attacks that the tier couldn't really stand up to. Defensively, Rhyperior was more important than general all-purpose tanking, specifically though it took a notable chunk from Draco Meteor, it was generally a highly effective answer to the monstrously dangerous Noivern, whose Hurricane off huge speed mowed through much of the tier with ease. Rhyperior stifled it and, as it did even if it took a Draco, regained momentum with rocks or just plain hard hitting. Being able to generate some leverage in return ensured one wasn't just waiting to collapse Noivern, but instead fighting back against it actively. Between this and its major threat level, Rhyperior was the best, easiest stealth rocker in UU, especially since it also thrived against Incineroar and Dual Blade, and could even pivot into Toxtricity. It blanked both stabs and could shrug off Boom Burst once. At the same time, Rhyperior actually saw usage in OU, which had a dearth of ground types, and thus Rhyperior's ability to do Rhyperior things was much more appreciated in this limited dex format. Then in the Isle of Armor, Rhyperior was no longer UU, but not because it had dropped, no. It was because it had rocketed up to a genuine OU status for the first time since Diamond and Pearl. Rotom Heat was smacking the tier around real fierce thanks to Nasty Plot, Boots, and the way it dominated top tier Pokemon in Clefable and Corviknight. What did this frightening metagame dominating beast do to Rhyperior? Switch out if it didn't want to get KO'd. Not only did Rhyperior utterly stifle Rotom Heat, but as it turned out, Rhyperior's new best use wasn't going to be playing Stealth Rock supporter. It was going to be as a Swords Dance beast. With its newly gained Heat Crash, it absolutely destroyed Corviknight, to say nothing of the immediate one-hit KO on Ferrothorn. The tier's best answer, Hippowdon, crumpled under the weight of a +2 Earthquake, to say nothing of the fact that its own Earthquake wasn't coming anywhere near actually threatening Rhyperior. Rhyperior had other excellent uses. It absolutely crushed Toxapex, of course, while also stifling Zeraora and even helping pivot around Cinderace before it was banned. Rhyperior in the Isle of Armor was one of the scariest wall breakers in OU. Of course, the Crown Tundra made sure that didn't last, with the massive power creep of an increased dex more resembling generations past, meaning it was completely unsurprising that Rhyperior was unfit for it, and as such, it made its returns to RU. It had quite a good niche in UU actually. It had serious ground competition in not just Hippowdon, but Excadrill, but was superb in combining the former's bulk with the latter's power and its ability to check Togekiss, Crobat, Noivern, and non-Grass Knot variants of Nihil-Eagle, while also being difficult to stomach hits from, which also served in its ability to pop up and maintain Stealth Rock. Not a superstar, but certainly solid. Now in RU, it was Rhyperior 101. Rocks taking on physical threats and flying types, hitting harder than such a tanky Pokemon generally does, and generally being difficult to take down. Its ability to irritate Toxtricity was particularly valued. Rhyperior was unspectacular in how it performed the same role it had since its first hit in UU in Gen 4, but that kind of non-flashy consistency provides exactly the kind of stability metagames need. RU was actually where Rhydon had started off in Generation 8, where the lower power level from the Slash Dex led to it, surprise surprise, become an amazing Stealth Rocker. Not that there was much competition at that point. An offensive threat capable of maiming even its checks without much difficulty. Newly unafraid of HP Grass, it took on threats like Salazzle and Charizard, then haphazardly clicked its hefty stabs, blasting through other staples like Snorlax, Steelix, and Drampa. Oh sure, the same Virizion that had annoyed Rhyperior previously was around, but Fire Punch and Toxic alike meant it was far from insurmountable. Just that one turn to nail it on the switch it had to make, lest a teammate get crushed, and suddenly Rhydon stabs were unstoppable progress makers again. Then the Isle of Armor came around, and Rhydon was stopped in its tracks. It was thoroughly middling, unfortunately, not just because it was so thoroughly outclassed by the absolutely amazing Mudsdale, one of the very best Pokemon in the tier, but also because it was so easy to check it with that ever-pesky water and grass weakness, effortlessly exploited by staples like Whimsicott, Cramorant, Jellicent, and the newly buffed Trevenant. As such, it wound up dropping to PU, where it was once again its usual consistent stealth-rocking self. It didn't mind its competition with Sandaconda, because it was so much more threatening, and thus able to cleave through a major portion of the tier staples like Wishiwashi, Clefairy, and Ferroseed. Unspectacular but consistent. That is, until the Crown Tundra came along, and while its power creep didn't completely remove Rhydon's viability, it did mean it now had to share PU with Gigalith, which outclassed it brutally with better typing and better support in Sandstorm. Rhydon avoided an untiered ranking because, well, it's not fully evolved, but even if it was a fully evolved Pokemon, to make it this far would have been astonishing, given its flaws. The fact that it did so as a not fully evolved one is all the more impressive, so chalk up another successful generation for the Ride duo. 2020 saw the emergence of Rhyperior as a seriously powerful Trick Room threat. It was particularly excellent with Dynamax, especially because the pitifully weak Bulldoze from its hyper-consistent Trick Room setting teammate Dusclops activated Weakness Policy and made it even more of a terror, especially since Bulldoze also slowed Rhyperior down, meaning it actually got even faster in Trick Room. It was incredibly destructive and spammed accordingly, so much so that we've had to limit the placements we're mentioning to top 5s. They are as follows: David Kotish 5th, Ermi Sahan 4th at the Bochum Germany Regionals, Justin Ramirez, Justin Burns, and Andrew Burley at 5th, 4th, and 3rd respectively at the Dallas, Texas Regionals, Wolf Glick 2nd at the Collinsville, Illinois Regionals, Tobias Kojiski 1st at the Malmo, Sweden Regionals, but after COVID hit and tournaments shifted to online, Rhyperior continued to succeed. At the 2020 Victory Road Spring League, Nicholas Carvalho reached 5th, while Adrian Hurley also reached 5th at the May Challenge. In 2021, Rhyperior pulled basically the same tricks, but with Porygon 2 appearing occasionally as its support. It had a more difficult time with the more expanded decks, but it was still quite a threat. Its results were Trainer Panda reaching 12th at the Asia Player Cup's Philippines qualifier, and the Players Cup 4 Oceania qualifier saw Sam Pandelis, Nicholas Bingham, and Paul Amedi reach 14th, 10th, and 9th respectively. At the 3rd Hatterene Series, Alexis Esparza reached 14th. Finally, at the Trainers Cup, Subin Yoon reached 4th. Rhyperior in Gen 9 can finally escape the curse of its typing through terrestrialization, able to eliminate any quadruple weakness. Now it can become the pure ground type it's always dreamed of, and it can potentially shift into another type entirely. So how has this worked in practice? Well, Gen 9's famously outrageous power creep actually meant it started off in NU. Yes, Rhyperior in NU is still as outrageous an idea, despite the fact that it's been an RU staple for so long. Those stats just don't feel like they belong. They didn't anyway. At least it had the consolation of being superb, as probably really wasn't surprising, given that it's still such a lower tier and Rhyperior is still so monstrous. But this actually didn't last because Rhyperior moved up all the way to UU through usage. This is frankly more astonishing than the drop to NU, but Rhyperior came by it honestly. The ability to take on both Zapdos' stabs and Heat Wave is staggeringly good given how threatening the bird is. It's similarly apt at taking on Tornado Styrian, while the same stabs it threatens these would similarly threaten to plow through much of the rest of the tier, especially because Mega Horn so perfectly pairs with them to shred the Hydrapple, Zarude, and Slowking that could tank it otherwise, especially the former two. Additionally, with Terra Dragon, Rhyperior's defensive profile becomes even more robust, able to flip the script on its water and grass weaknesses, while becoming neutral to ground, fighting, and steel is incredibly useful for a Pokemon of its bulk as well. Suddenly, you're able to stay on Greninja or Superior, for example, while being much better at staying in against Okidogi, Cobalion, and Metagross. Rhyperior does have competition in UU though. Excadrill is the biggest one, with its much better speed, steel typing, and incredible support with Rapid Spin. It's especially important given its rank atop the tier's viability. Additionally, Gastrodon's ever-reliable defensive profile now comes bolstered with spikes. However, Gastrodon doesn't devour hurricanes like Rhyperior does. While Excadrill may resist Zapdos and Tornado Styrian stabs, but has to flee from Heat Wave, Rhyperior tanks it all, and dishes out the pain in return to boot. All in all, Rhyperior is having a solid 9th generation. Meanwhile, Rhydon can no longer cut it in even PU, which shouldn't be surprising after Gen 8 was already too much for it. Gen 9 was just absurd. Still, that's hardly a knock against it. Rhyperior is more limited than ever VGC-wise, but it made a 2024 appearance thanks to Christian Solano reaching 36 with it at the LA Regionals, with a Terra Fairy Assault Vest set supporting Zacian Crown, Ogerpon, Hearthflame, and Annihilate. At least that's something. And that's it. So how great were Rhydon and Rhyperior actually? Well, these two form one of the best evolutionary duels of all time. It's just been one stellar generation after another. Rhydon was a defining force of Gen 1 OU, countering Zapdos and smashing through all in sight alike. It was also a strong player in Gen 2 OU, despite excellent competition. It stuck to a small OU niche in the BL Limbo-ridden Gen 3, but in Gen 4 it evolved into Rhyperior, and there, with Titanic Bulk and access to both Solid and Stealth Rock, it became one of the most defining lower tier support Pokemon ever. It actually had a strong OU niche in that generation, as well as briefly ascending to proper OU status in the Rotom Heat dominated period of Gen 8. But by and large, it's been tracing its path across multiple generations of UU and RU, being especially defining in the latter tier. Meanwhile, Rhydon basically did the same as Rhyperior, starting in Gen 4's NU, then maintaining viability across lower tiers despite, or rather because of, its not fully evolved status, wielding Eviolite en route to superb bulk that gave it new life. It too continued across RU and NU for generations, finally only succumbing to a lack of viability in Gen 8's Crown Tundra. As for VGC, both of them were flawed thanks to their weaknesses being quite exploitable in a doubles format, but they also found a great deal of success, namely in Gens 5, 6, and 8. Both Rhydon and Rhyperior basically did the same thing over and over, but what they did was essential, and they did it so well, which is why they were such a common sight generation after generation. They were indeed great. Thanks for watching, everyone. And as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content. And in the comments, I want to know, what do you think about competitive Rhydon and Rhyperior? How would you buff them? Whatever it is, let us know in the comments. Also, thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos, and thank you to everyone else watching as well. And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Bingleton, Daniel Isbeast, Dr. Mint, Funky, Glitcherton, Gustavo, Hal, Nurse Jake, Jack G, Lord of the Rabbit, Pretzel SP, Raven Daytona Ring, Ray Ray, Skylaria, Soares and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, and Quetzalcoatl Northropi for their major support of our videos. And follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.